bearing autonomous subject that in turn is defined in opposition to the image of the child. So children are under coverture in Anglo-American law generally because they're defined legally and socially as persons who lack full autonomy and agency and therefore are incapable of being rights bearers. Although, as Martha Feynman and others have demonstrated, it's interdependency that best describes human relationships. Children and adults are nevertheless defined reciprocally. Adults as the persons who are independent, children as the people who are dependent. There's no gray area within this binary opposition. You're an adult or you're a child. And moreover, as children's rights advocates have found, trying to bestow rights on children within the system, as rights have been defined in our tradition, doesn't work. Because children's reality makes plain Martha's point that autonomy, as it's been conceived of under liberal law, is a fiction. That children can't be independent agents in the way law imagines us all to be. And second, perhaps more significantly, giving children rights immediately calls into question parental rights. And parents don't want to give up their power, especially if the menu is restricted to the zero-sum game. And finally, children don't even come close to being the rational actors that the law imagines all persons are. Very young children, for example, live in a world that's not fully captured by language. And that's different from the point that children are dependent on adults. It's rather the idea that children's wants and needs are not fully expressible in a language of interests and preferences. The experiences of children can't easily be mapped onto the grid of agency and intentionality that law requires. So, secondly, two major state institutions in our country, the child welfare state and the criminal justice state, themselves generate an enormous amount of violence. And I'm thinking particularly about the criminal justice state's role in producing gender violence. And here the state and the culture are really intertwined. So I'll talk about gender violence separately in a minute. So turning from the state now to the family, the third major social sphere being the family, it too is currently constructed, makes children as a class vulnerable to violence. The normative family, as we know it, is constituted as patriarchal, so that as long as you're constituted as a full citizen, not a failed citizen under the guardianship of the state, your authority over your children is complete. The family is constituted as private, so that power relations within the family are shielded from state intervention, even sometimes from social view. And it's nuclear, so that the family is isolated within civil society as the institution with almost sole responsibility for the socialization and nurture of children, with very little support from the state. Just a little bit about each of these points. The patriarchal family. Barbara Woodhouse has argued that children, being naturally dependent, are seen under family law as belonging to the individuals who create them to a majority, and they acquire the status of independent individuals. Although we hear modern family law speak in terms of the child as an individual whose best interest is its focal point, we've seen how it reifies children, treating them like personal property. And that's a quote from a very interesting piece that she's written. So we have this notion within family law of parental sovereignty and the property and children as property. And a respect for the sovereignty of parents and the right to violence against children that sovereignty entails is reflected both in custom, such as the custom of disciplining children physically, and in law. As to the family as a private institution, we can look at the cooperation of family and criminal law as drawing a shield of partial protection from sanction around intra-family violence, especially violence against children. In criminal law, the so-called domestic discount ensures that parents who hurt or kill their children are punished less harshly than non-parents. And Jennifer Collins has done important work in this area. She points out, for example, that all states criminalize sexual offenses committed against children, but if the offender is a family member, many states allow the prosecutor to file charges under an incest statute rather than under a general rape or sexual abuse statute. And incest convictions typically carry far less significant penalties. Looking at New Jersey sex registration laws, Rose Corrigan found that individuals convicted of incest are excluded from the state's online sex offender database. Collins writes that the available evidence suggests that parents who abuse their own children rather than strangers are charged less often and sentenced less severely than adults who abuse non-relatives. And she did a small-scale study of prosecutions for children accidentally killed by neglect, finding that fathers were less likely to be prosecuted than mothers, parents with lower incomes were more likely to be prosecuted than parents with higher incomes, and unrelated caretakers were more likely to be prosecuted than parents. And finally, the family is a nuclear system. As Laura Rosenberry argues, in family law, children only have vertical relationships to adults. They have no recognized horizontal relationships, such as friendships. And the law has been even slow to recognize vertical relationships other than those with parents. More generally, the nuclear family is given almost complete responsibility for creating, nurturing, caring for, and socializing the next generation with very little help. And here I'm thinking about Nebraska's Legislative Bill 157, which created a safe haven for families or people who left children in custody of hospitals. And it's been interesting to see that since the law went into effect in July, at least 30 children have been dropped off at state licensed hospitals, many being teenagers, not babies, as the law imagines. Nearly all were older than 10, and this includes people from out of state, some families coming from as far away as Georgia, Michigan, and Iowa to Nebraska to drop off their children. And that's to say that it's not only poverty that fosters violence, it's also isolation and desperation. These are families in crisis. These are not bad families. These are families who recognize that they've come to the end of their limit, that they're not receiving the help and support that they need, whether from the state or from civil society. So these are some of the institutional conditions then that make children as a class vulnerable to violence. I want to turn next to the cultural conditions that make it possible for violence against children to be both abhorred, right, and decried, but also minimized, ignored, and justified. And the first one is the most obvious one to feminist theorists, which is the gender system. And in particular, what a recent panel at Critical Resistance 10 called monstrous masculinities. As I've written elsewhere, a significant amount of violence in this country is gender violence, and violence that's specifically gendered male. So sexual domination and exploitation, sexism, homophobia, each of these systems is maintained by violence that's connected deeply to masculine identity. So violence and norm of masculinity are intertwined, and this intertwining begins in the family, often with the use of violence, physical or not, as a tool for socializing young boys into their gender identity. And family gender violence is echoed, reflected, and amplified in state violence through the criminal justice system. As James Gilligan and others have recognized, prison violence both reflects and solidifies masculine gender violence. From this perspective, families provide training for domination, under which gender violence features prominently, which is then implemented on an institutional scale in prisons. If people are not violent when they enter prison, they certainly are violent when they come out of it. And both families in prison emphasize the masculine, again, identification of violence and identity. A second cultural condition that makes it possible for violence against children to be abhorred but also tolerated is less obvious, I think, and deeply entwined with race. So legal norms are mutually constitutive with cultural norms, and both are permeated with what I call structures of feeling, borrowing that term from Raymond Williams. And two interlocking structures of feeling, I think, are particularly relevant to producing the tolerance we have as a society for certain kinds of violence against children. Both, I think, are saturated with racialized gender. I call the first moral fury and the second sentimentality. So moral fury is the spirit of righteous hatred that permeates the American criminal justice system, with its relentless search for perpetrators and its unslakable thirst for the punishment of evildoers. Moral fury is easily channeled into institutional conditions conducive to violence, the criminal justice state being the primary one. And moral fury goes unchecked by a concern for the well-being of those in jail and prison and the people they leave behind in the community because of the fusion of racial stereotypes with the idea of the criminal. The fantasy figure that melds the black man and the criminal together makes makes it possible for us to exercise our moral fury and to not